Sarah Martinez had always been the quiet one in her unit. While other soldiers joked loudly during mess hall dinners or played cards late into the night, she preferred reading books in her bunk or writing letters home to her younger sister. At 24, she had joined the military not for glory or adventure, but because her family needed the steady income and benefits. Her father worked double shifts at a factory, and her mother cleaned offices at night just to make ends meet. The morning started like any other at Fort Henderson. The autumn air was crisp and fallen leaves crunched under combat boots as soldiers made their way to the physical training area. Sarah had been dreading this day for weeks. Today was the quarterly fitness assessment, and she knew she would struggle with the upper body strength requirements. Her shoulder had been bothering her for months, a dull ache that seemed to worsen with certain movements. Colonel James Harrison was known throughout the base for his strict standards and no-nonsense attitude. He had served 3 tours overseas and expected nothing less than perfection from his soldiers. Standing at attention in his perfectly pressed uniform, he surveyed the assembled troops with sharp eyes that missed nothing. His reputation preceded him, fair but demanding and absolutely intolerant of excuses. As the soldiers lined up for their fitness tests, Sarah felt her heart racing. The pull-ups were always her weakest event, and today her shoulder felt particularly stiff. She had considered going to the medical bay earlier in the week, but the thought of being labeled as weak or seeking special treatment kept her away. In her mind, asking for help was admitting failure. When her turn came for the pull-up bar, Sarah approached with visible hesitation. She grabbed the bar with both hands, took a deep breath, and attempted to lift herself up. Pain shot through her left shoulder like lightning, and she could barely manage half a pull-up before her arms gave out. She tried again, gritting her teeth against the discomfort, but managed only one complete repetition before dropping to the ground. Colonel Harrison watched with growing impatience. He had seen this before. Soldiers who hadn't trained properly trying to make excuses when test day arrived. His jaw tightened as he observed Sarah's struggle, interpreting her difficulty as laziness rather than a genuine physical issue. Other soldiers in line began to whisper among themselves. Some felt sympathy for Sarah, knowing she was typically dedicated and hardworking. Others, however, started to question whether she was really trying her best or simply looking for an easy way out of the demanding physical requirements. Sarah's face burned with embarrassment as she realized she wouldn't be able to complete the minimum number of pull-ups required to pass this portion of the test. Her military career, her family's financial stability, and her own sense of self-worth suddenly felt like they were hanging in the balance. The weight of expectation from her fellow soldiers, her commanding officer, and herself pressed down on her shoulders like a heavy burden. The training ground fell unusually quiet except for the sound of wind rustling through nearby trees. Sarah stood there, chest heaving from exertion and pain, knowing that what happened next would define not just her performance review, but possibly her entire future in the military. She looked up at Colonel Harrison, whose expression had grown increasingly stern, and realized she was about to face a moment that would test more than just her physical strength. Colonel Harrison stepped forward, his boots clicking against the concrete with military precision. His face showed the familiar expression that every soldier on base had learned to recognize, disappointment mixed with barely contained irritation. The morning sun cast long shadows across the training ground as he approached Sarah, who was still catching her breath from her failed attempt at the pull-ups. "Martinez," he said, his voice carrying across the silent training area, "would you care to explain to me and your fellow soldiers why you're unable to complete a basic fitness requirement that every member of this unit is expected to meet?" His tone was measured but carried an edge that made nearby soldiers shift uncomfortably in formation. Sarah felt dozens of eyes boring into her. Some of her fellow soldiers looked away, embarrassed for her, while others watched with the kind of morbid curiosity that comes with witnessing someone else's public failure. The weight of their collective attention felt heavier than any physical exercise she had ever attempted. "Sir, I've been having some trouble with my shoulder," Sarah managed to say, though her voice came out smaller than she intended. She immediately regretted how weak the words sounded, how much like an excuse they seemed hanging in the air between her and the colonel. Colonel Harrison's eyebrows rose slightly, and a sound that could only be described as a chuckle escaped from his lips. It wasn't a warm laugh. It was the kind of dry, skeptical sound that military officers make when they've heard every excuse in the book. Shoulder trouble, he repeated, loud enough for everyone to hear. How convenient that this shoulder trouble appeared right before your fitness assessment. Several soldiers in the formation exchanged glances. They had all heard similar excuses before. Mysterious injuries that seemed to appear just when physical performance was being evaluated. It was a tale as old as military service itself, and Colonel Harrison had dealt with his share of soldiers trying to avoid accountability for poor preparation. Let me guess. Martinez, the colonel continued, his voice taking on a slightly mocking tone. This shoulder trouble doesn't affect your ability to carry your gear, participate in drills, or perform your regular duties. It only seems to be a problem when it comes time to prove your physical fitness to your commanding officers. Sarah's cheeks burned with shame and frustration. She wanted to explain that the pain was real, that she wasn't making excuses, but every word that came to mind sounded like exactly what the colonel accused her of. Weak justifications from a soldier who hadn't prepared adequately for her assessment. The other members of her unit stood in perfect formation, but Sarah could sense their discomfort with the situation unfolding before them. Military discipline demanded they remain silent and motionless, but the tension was palpable. Some of them had trained alongside Sarah for months and knew her to be dedicated and hardworking, but others were beginning to question whether they had misjudged her character. In my 20 years of service, Colonel Harrison announced to the assembled soldiers, I have heard every excuse imaginable. Sore backs, twisted ankles, pulled muscles, family emergencies, lack of sleep, improper nutrition. You name it, I've heard it. His voice grew stronger as he warmed to his topic. But at the end of the day, a soldier's job is to be ready for anything at any time, regardless of minor discomforts or inconveniences. Sarah felt tears threatening to form in her eyes, but she fought them back with every ounce of strength she possessed. Crying in front of her unit and commanding officer would only confirm every negative assumption being made about her character and fitness for military service. The colonel took another step closer, his presence imposing and authoritative. So here's what we're going to do, Martinez. You're going to stop making excuses, grab that pull-up bar again, and show me and everyone here what a real soldier looks like when they push through adversity. His words carried the weight of both a challenge and a final warning. Sarah stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, though it was probably only seconds. The colonel's challenge hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield, and she knew that everyone present was waiting to see how she would respond. Her military jacket felt suddenly heavy on her shoulders, and she could feel sweat forming on her palms despite the cool morning air. The training ground was so quiet that she could hear her own heartbeat drumming in her ears. Other soldiers maintained their positions, but she sensed their curiosity and judgment. Some probably thought she was about to fold under pressure, while others might have been hoping she would prove the colonel wrong. The uncertainty in their minds was almost as painful as the physical discomfort in her shoulder. Colonel Harrison crossed his arms and waited, his expression making it clear that he expected immediate compliance with his order. His reputation for breaking down soldiers who he believed were weak or uncommitted was well known throughout the base. Many junior officers had learned to fear these moments when his patience ran thin and his true feelings about military discipline became apparent. Sarah looked up at the pull-up bar, its cold metal surface gleaming in the morning sunlight. She knew that attempting another set of pull-ups would send waves of agony through her damaged shoulder, but she also understood that refusing would essentially end her military career. The choice before her seemed impossible: endure physical pain that might cause lasting damage, or accept public humiliation and professional failure. I'm waiting. Martinez, Colonel Harrison said, his voice cutting through her internal struggle. Unless you're planning to add wasting my time to your list of offenses this morning. His words carried the implicit threat. That had become his signature. Comply immediately or face consequences. That extended far beyond this single fitness assessment. Something shifted inside Sarah at that moment. The combination of public embarrassment, unfair accusations, and the colonel's dismissive attitude toward her genuine injury created a spark of anger that she hadn't expected. She had always been the type to avoid confrontation, to apologize even when she wasn't at fault. But something about this situation felt different. She thought about her family back home, counting on her military salary to help pay bills and support her younger sister's education. She thought about the months of dedicated service she had given to her unit, The late nights spent studying military protocols, the weekends she had volunteered for extra duties. None of that seemed to matter now, in this moment when she was being judged solely on her inability to complete a physical task that her injury made nearly impossible. Sarah reached up and began to unbutton her military jacket. The action was slow and deliberate, and Colonel Harrison's expression shifted from impatience to confusion. This wasn't the response he had expected. Soldiers typically either attempted the exercise again or offered more excuses. But removing uniform items during a fitness assessment was highly unusual. "What exactly do you think you're doing, Martinez?" he asked. Though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence, something in Sarah's demeanor had changed, and even he could sense that this moment was about to take an unexpected turn. Other soldiers began to take notice of Sarah's unusual behavior. Those who had been looking away now focused their attention on the unfolding scene, sensing that something significant was about to happen. The atmosphere on the training ground shifted from routine disciplinary action to something else entirely, a tension that suggested everyone present was about to witness something they had never seen before. Sarah continued removing her jacket with steady, purposeful movements. Her face showed a determination that hadn't been there moments before, as if she had finally decided that the time for explanations and apologies had passed. Whatever she was about to reveal had given her a strength that surprised even herself. As Sarah's jacket fell away from her shoulders, a collective gasp rippled through the assembled soldiers. What they saw beneath her standard-issue t-shirt defied every assumption that had been made about her character, her service record, and her reasons for struggling with the physical assessment. Running from her left shoulder blade down across her shoulder and partway down her arm was a series of scars that could only have come from one source: shrapnel, wounds from an explosive device. The scars were not neat surgical lines, but irregular, jagged marks that spoke of metal fragments tearing through flesh and muscle. Some areas showed the telltale signs of burns that had healed imperfectly, creating patches of discolored skin that would remain with her forever. Colonel Harrison's expression transformed instantly from skeptical authority to shocked recognition. In his 20 years of military service, he had seen similar wounds on countless soldiers returning from combat zones. These were not the marks of training accidents or minor injuries. They were the permanent reminders of someone who had faced enemy fire and survived to tell about it. The silence on the training ground became profound and uncomfortable. Soldiers who had been questioning Sarah's commitment moments before now found themselves staring at evidence of service and sacrifice that exceeded anything most of them had experienced. The whispers and judgmental glances stopped abruptly, replaced by a stunned quiet that acknowledged they had completely misjudged the situation. Sarah stood with her arms at her sides, allowing everyone present to see the full extent of her injuries. The morning sunlight highlighted every irregular line and patch of damaged tissue, creating a visual story of survival that was more powerful than any words she could have spoken. Her posture remained straight and military proper, but there was now a dignity in her bearing that commanded respect. "These scars came from an IED explosion outside Kandahar 18 months ago," Sarah said, her voice steady and clear. "3 soldiers in my convoy were killed instantly. I spent 4 months in military hospitals, underwent 6 surgeries, and was told I was lucky to keep full use of my arm." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the assembled group. Colonel Harrison stood motionless, his face showing the internal struggle of someone whose entire understanding of a situation had been turned upside down. Military protocol demanded certain responses to insubordination or poor performance, but there was no handbook for dealing with a decorated combat veteran whose service record had been hidden beneath a standard fitness assessment. "I was medically cleared for active duty," Sarah continued, "but the doctors warned me that cold weather and certain physical activities would always cause pain and reduced mobility in my left shoulder. I've been managing the discomfort for months because I needed this assignment, and my family depends on my military income." Several soldiers in the formation shifted uncomfortably, realizing that their earlier assumptions about Sarah's character had been not just wrong, but deeply unfair to someone who had already given more in service to their country than most of them ever would. The easy categories of dedicated soldier versus excuse-maker suddenly seemed childish and inadequate. The physical evidence of Sarah's combat service was undeniable and humbling. Each scar represented a moment when she had been willing to risk everything for her fellow soldiers and her mission. The idea that she would need to make excuses or avoid responsibility seemed absurd when viewed against the permanent reminders of her courage and sacrifice. Colonel Harrison cleared his throat, a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the continued silence. For the first time since arriving at the training ground that morning, he appeared uncertain about how to proceed. His usual confidence in handling military discipline had been shaken by the revelation that his assumptions about Sarah's situation had been completely wrong. Morning sun continued to shine down on the training ground, but everything about the atmosphere had changed. What had begun as a routine fitness assessment and disciplinary moment had become something else entirely. A lesson in the danger of quick judgments and the hidden stories that soldiers carry with them long after their most difficult service has ended. The transformation in Colonel Harrison's demeanor was visible to everyone present. The stern, uncompromising officer who had been lecturing about excuses and military standards just minutes earlier now stood facing a combat veteran whose service record he had completely misjudged. His shoulders seemed to sag slightly under the weight of his mistake, and his eyes showed the kind of regret that comes from realizing you have wronged someone who deserved better treatment. "Martinez," he said quietly, his voice now carrying none of the earlier mockery or impatience. "Why didn't you inform me about your combat injuries and medical limitations? Your service record should have included information about any physical restrictions resulting from combat wounds." His question was genuine, lacking the accusatory tone that had dominated his earlier comments. Sarah picked up her jacket from the ground, handling it carefully as she prepared to put it back on. The simple act of covering her scars seemed to require more effort than removing the jacket had, as if she was reluctant to hide the evidence of her service again. "Sir, I was afraid that reporting my limitations would affect my assignment and my ability to serve," she replied. "My family depends on my military income, and I didn't want to be seen as someone who couldn't handle the physical demands of active duty." The other soldiers in formation listened with growing understanding of how difficult Sarah's position had been. She had been caught between the need to prove herself capable and the reality of dealing with combat injuries that would affect her for the rest of her life. Many of them realized they might have made similar choices if faced with the same circumstances. Colonel Harrison removed his military cap and ran a hand through his graying hair, a gesture that revealed his discomfort with the situation more clearly than words could have. "Martinez, hiding combat injuries from your commanding officers isn't just dangerous for you. It's dangerous for your entire unit. We need to know about any limitations that might affect mission readiness or soldier safety." His tone remained serious but had shifted to that of a concerned superior rather than an angry disciplinarian. "I understand that now, sir," Sarah responded, her voice showing both respect and a new confidence that hadn't been there at the beginning of the morning. "I was wrong to hide my medical situation, but I was also afraid of being judged as weak or unable to serve effectively. I've spent 18 months trying to prove that my injuries don't define my value as a soldier." Several soldiers in the formation nodded slightly, understanding the impossible position Sarah had found herself in. Military culture often emphasized pushing through pain and avoiding any appearance of weakness, but combat injuries created complex situations where the usual rules about toughness and endurance needed to be balanced against medical reality and long-term health. Colonel Harrison replaced his cap and straightened his posture, returning to his role as commanding officer, but with a completely different understanding of the soldier standing before him. "Your service record will be updated to reflect your combat injuries and any necessary accommodations. You'll report to the medical officer this afternoon for a complete evaluation of your current physical capabilities and limitations." The colonel then turned to address the entire assembled unit. "Let this be a lesson to all of you about the importance of complete honesty regarding medical conditions and combat injuries. We cannot protect our soldiers or maintain unit readiness if we don't have accurate information about everyone's physical capabilities." His voice carried the authority of his rank, but also a new awareness of how complex these situations could become. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and apprehension as she realized that her secret was finally out in the open. The fear of discovery that had haunted her for months was gone, but she now faced uncertainty about how this revelation would affect her military career and her family's financial security. The training ground that had felt like a place of judgment and failure just minutes earlier now seemed like the setting for a difficult but necessary conversation about service, sacrifice, and the hidden struggles that soldiers sometimes carry alone. As the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, it became clear that this fitness assessment would be remembered not for its test results, but for the lesson it taught about assumptions, courage, and the complex realities faced by those who serve their country in combat zones. 3 months later, Sarah Martinez stood in the same training area where her world had changed that autumn morning. The leaves had long since fallen and been cleared away, and winter had settled over Fort Henderson with its characteristic chill and gray skies. But everything else about her situation had transformed in ways she could never have imagined when she first struggled with those pull-ups. The medical evaluation that Colonel Harrison had ordered revealed the full extent of her combat injuries and led to a complete reassessment of her physical fitness requirements. Instead of being forced out of the military as she had feared, Sarah was reassigned to duties that utilized her intelligence, combat experience, and leadership potential rather than focusing solely on upper body strength requirements that her injuries made difficult. Colonel Harrison had personally ensured that Sarah's service record was properly updated to reflect not just her limitations, but also her combat decorations and the circumstances under which she had been wounded. The Purple Heart and Combat Action Badge that she had never mentioned to her fellow soldiers were now part of her official file, along with commendations from her previous commanding officers who had praised her courage under fire. More importantly, Sarah had become something she never expected, a mentor and advocate for other soldiers dealing with hidden injuries or struggling to balance military expectations with physical limitations. Word of her story had spread throughout the base not as gossip or entertainment, but as an important lesson about the complexity of military service and the need for better communication between soldiers and their commanding officers. The changes went beyond just Sarah's individual situation. Colonel Harrison had implemented new protocols for fitness assessments that included confidential medical consultations and alternative evaluation methods for soldiers with documented combat injuries. The goal was to maintain military readiness while acknowledging that soldiers who had served in combat zones might require different approaches to physical fitness and duty assignments. Sarah's fellow soldiers, many of whom had initially questioned her commitment and character, had gradually come to understand the courage it had taken for her to serve for months while managing significant pain and physical limitations. Several had approached her privately to apologize for their earlier assumptions and to seek advice about their own undisclosed injuries or medical concerns. The relationship between Sarah and Colonel Harrison had evolved into one of mutual respect based on their shared understanding of military service and sacrifice. He had admitted privately that her situation had taught him important lessons about leadership and the danger of making quick judgments about soldiers based on limited information. His leadership style had become more thoughtful and inclusive as a result of the experience. On this particular winter morning, Sarah was leading a training session for new recruits, teaching them about military protocols and the importance of honest communication with their commanding officers. Her story had become part of the unofficial curriculum at Fort Henderson, not as a cautionary tale, but as an example of how difficult situations could be resolved through courage, honesty, and mutual respect. The scars on her shoulder remained visible reminders of her combat service, but they no longer felt like secrets she needed to hide. Instead, they had become symbols of survival, service, and the complex realities faced by modern military personnel. Young soldiers who saw them understood immediately that they were learning from someone who had faced real danger and emerged stronger. As Sarah watched the new recruits practice their formations and listen attentively to her instructions, she reflected on how much her life had changed since that embarrassing morning when she couldn't complete her pull-ups. The fear and shame that had dominated her thoughts for months had been replaced by a sense of purpose and belonging that she had never experienced before in her military career. The training ground that had once felt like a place of judgment and failure had become a space where she could share her knowledge and experience with the next generation of soldiers. Her story served as proof that military service was not just about physical strength or perfect performance, but about courage, integrity, and the willingness to serve others despite personal challenges and limitations. Colonel Harrison often observed these training sessions from a distance, noting how effectively Sarah connected with young soldiers and helped them understand the complexities of military life. Her journey from struggling soldier to respected mentor had become one of his proudest achievements as a commanding officer, proving that good leadership sometimes meant admitting mistakes and creating opportunities for redemption and growth.